We've got 18 days to go, but I think you and I both know that that doesn't mean this race is settled 18 days from now. What are you bracing for?
Well, I think that a few things are happening at once. On the one hand, we should never lose sight of how extraordinary it is that there are so many efforts to undermine public confidence and trust in the voting before it happens. There's no doubt that the election deniers are much better organized than they were in 2020, much better funded, on the one hand. On the other hand, the election system has been hardened. Election officials are ready. From what I can see, they're working with law enforcement. Congress passed a law to make it much harder to mess with the Electoral College. And so the bottom line is, in terms of what we all need to do as voters and as citizens, there's no reason to think that voters should be able to vote in a way that is free and fair and without incident. You're right, though, that what I'm more worried about are all the things that could come afterwards. The efforts, even if there's nothing legitimate to worry about, to discredit the results. Yes, there's always some litigation and other things that's appropriate. But we could certainly see a major effort to discredit the results, even if they are clear as day.
Well, obviously, we all saw what happened in 2020. No court actually found substantive Donald Trump's claims that he, in fact, won the election or that Joe Biden really lost it. But I wonder if lessons have also been learned by the way 2020 was litigated. How do you expect 2024 cases might be argued differently depending on how the loser feels about the fact that they lost?
Well, you're right. In 2020, there were dozens and dozens of rulings from Republican and Democratic judges who said, no, there was no evidence of misconduct, of a rigged election, of fraud. And there's encouraging evidence already that some of these guardrails are beginning to really hold. In Georgia, just in the last few days, the state election board, which was packed with MAGA supporters who Donald Trump hailed at his rallies, had ordered that there be hand counts of the numbers of ballots and a whole bunch of other things. And a judge in Georgia said, no, it's way too close to the election to do these things, and blocked it. You're seeing in Pennsylvania an effort by a number of legislators to try to stop the counting of votes from people living overseas, which is mostly military people. And I'll tell you, as a former Blue Star parent myself, I'm very concerned about that. A lot of veterans groups and others went to court today to argue that this is wrong. So a lot of this stuff is playing out before the election. The big question is going to be the court of public opinion. You're seeing a lot of rumors being spread, a lot of disinformation being put out there. I think it's for all of us and for the media to knock those down as soon as they come up, and not let the fact, as you said, as Joe Trippi said, it's going to take a few days to count the votes. That's not a sign of problems or chaos at the polls. That's actually election workers doing their job.
Well, and we know that many of them in 2020 faced threats, were defamed. In fact, some of them have won court cases around defamation themselves in the case of a few poll workers in Georgia. As we consider the way in which all of this could work through the courts, how much do you expect the Supreme Court to be involved in whatever happens after the election? They're ultimately going to be the final say here, possibly?
You know, possibly. It's only happened in the last century once in American history, in the year 2000. In 2020, the Supreme Court, led by John Roberts, stayed very far away from getting involved in those cases. When Texas sued Pennsylvania, they swatted it down. They knew that they should not be making those decisions. I hope that that's what they do again this time. And it's frankly hard to see the path for a case to get to the Supreme Court. Everyone kind of assumes, oh, well, they're going to make the final call. You need a case to get to them that would enable them to do that. This has, in my view, been a very political court, and I would be nervous about what they would do, but that doesn't mean they will even necessarily get a case that would be significant.
Well, fair enough. As we consider the way this is being discussed on the campaign trail, it was brought up by the Republican vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, who was in Pennsylvania earlier this week, and he had this to say to voters about election integrity.
This election is tight, my friends. I think we're going to win, but in Pennsylvania and a few other states, it's really tight. And we have to get so many votes that whatever crap the Democrats pull, we are going to overwhelm their BS, and we're going to make Donald Trump the next president of the United States. The RNC has done more on election integrity in the past 3 months than the Republican Party had done in the last 3 years. It's a record to be proud of. And I won't tell you that everything is perfect, but I will tell you we're doing a lot better now than we were 4 years ago.
We obviously aren't where we were 4 years ago in a lot of senses, Michael, including that the 2020 election happened in the middle of a pandemic, which is why so many people were choosing to vote absentee rather than going to their polling places. So if we're considering the challenges that were brought around mail-in voting, absentee voting in 2020, do you believe the narrative around that, the trust the American people have in that method of voting has been repaired, or is there still enough rhetoric around the idea that maybe mail-in voting is stupid or somehow rigged, that it actually could make people choose not to vote in that way?
Well, of course, J.D. Vance and his running mate often say two different things because they say that it's a big problem, but they also want to urge their own supporters to take advantage of it. You're right that in 2020, because of the extraordinary situation of the pandemic, the number of people who voted by mail but more or less doubled. It was an extraordinary civic achievement that in the middle of a pandemic that had shut down society, we had the highest voter turnout since 1900. And Donald Trump's own Department of Homeland Security said it was the most secure election in American history. It was really a great civic achievement. In this election, a lot of people are kind of going back more toward how they voted previously. A lot of people will be voting in person on Election Day. A lot of people will be voting early, and many people will be voting by mail. But they happily don't have the worry of the pandemic and the health issues. That was why people were voting by mail often. A lot of the charges in 2020 were absolutely crazy, that voting machines were flipping votes, you had to search in ballot paper for bamboo fibers because that would prove they were printed in China and things like that. And a lot of it drawing on people's unease about the changes in voting during the pandemic. This time, there really haven't been those changes. And I'm very concerned that partisan operatives are now spreading lies about non-citizen voting, which they claim, lots and lots of people are doing. States have a multiplicity of systems in place to make sure that only citizens vote, and only citizens do vote. So when people hear about non-citizen voting after the election, oh, wow, that was a real problem, people need to have their kind of guard up because it's just not true. It's a lie, and it's partisan politicians using that lie deliberately to stoke public distrust in the system. I don't think these things are going to lead to an upending of the result, but they could lead to a collapse of public trust even further in our democracy, and that would be a real shame.